So join me, Marcus, on part 2 of our Garw Valley Walk. But don't worry, if you haven't seen part 1, you can still enjoy part 2. Well, originally I was going to do a walk in the Garw Valley, walking the western side through the forest and over to the eastern side. But if you saw part 1, it was raining a bit. It was raining really heavily. So I cut the walk into 2. I walked from here, Blaengarw, and where I've parked, Parc Calon Lan, through the woods on the western side down to Pontycymer. The plan was to walk up the eastern side over there from Pontycymer back round to Blaengarw that way, and that's what I'm going to do today. As before, I'm starting here in Parc Calon Lan, which has got a free car park. It's in Blaengarw, and I'll put a link to this car park or the coordinates in the description. As I've mentioned, you can do this part 2 independently of part 1, or you can combine it with part 1 for the big circular walk. If you look at the map, you can see what I'll show. Part 1 was the western side of the valley, and part 2 will be the eastern side of the valley. Have a look at the map. So as before, we leave the car park and take a right 50 yards up to the wooden bridge. And look how calm it is today. By the way, if you haven't seen part 1, have a quick look at this. You can see why I stopped halfway round. And the stream is much calmer as well. Look at it now. So as you come over the bridge, the original walk went up there through the forest, but we're going to take the easy route along the river. So we're walking down into the sun today, alongside the river on your left. As I mentioned in the first video, this area is just over 7 miles north of the M4 junction 36, so it's really quick to get to. Back in the early 1800s, the population of the valley was only about 100 people. There was mining, but there were small drift mines on the side of the mountain where they cut into the mountain, and the coal they mined there was dragged over on a tramway to the Ogmore Valley. But when the railway came in 1876, then they could really access the coal reserves. And within 10 years of the railway arriving, there were 4 collieries in this area. And that's where the influx of people came from to work in the mines and the associated businesses, and the families like Mel's family, my dad's family, they all came to this area to work back during that period. Those 4 collieries were mining nearly 4,000 tonnes of coal a day. And it's hard to imagine that now as you walk around this area, how peaceful and green it is. There aren't many signs of that industrial past, but if you look carefully, you can still find them. On part 1, I was up there and I could find the old cables coming out of the ground that have been planted over. The mines themselves, like the Falda colliery, opened in 1877, the Darren in 1880, and then the Blaengarw Ocean Coal Company, known as the Garw, in 1883. Obviously the mines were nationalised in 1947, and in the 1970s the Falda and the Garw were amalgamated and worked as one unit, and that was the last colliery to close, the Garw, in 1985. We will be walking past that site on the way back. Anyway, we're getting close to the starting point of part 2, where I finished the walk in part 1 as I came off the mountain here down to the riverside. So I'll see you there. So I walked down from Parc Calon Lan, following the river on my left, until I get to this point here. And this is where I came down off the mountain, the western side, in part 1. Then because the weather was so bad, I walked back up to the park there. So this is the starting point for part 2 now, continuing from part 1. I'll put the coordinates of this point, like I mentioned, below, just to go over it again. So I came off the mountain last week. Instead of going that way, I went back to the car park that way. But I'm continuing towards Pontycymer this way now. And the weather is so much better. It's perfect today. There's hardly any wind. It's not too cold. And the main thing, it's dry. It's incredible to see the level of the water, how low it is today compared to the flooding of last week. So we leave the path onto a small street and we take a left into Pontycymer itself. Am I getting a bit tight for those gaps? So we take a left over the river. There's a bus station and a co-op. And we follow the road right. So we've crossed the river into Pontycymer itself. We go past a bus stop, we take a right, and then we'll be crossing the road again and going up a terraced street. I think it's called Alexandria Street. Cross the road and we go up this terraced street here. What is the name? Alexandra Road. I stand corrected. So we continue up this street. At the top, there's a church and quite a big graveyard. And we take a small lane to the right just before we get to that. Just before the graveyard, you can see a little sign, and we go down there. Then you get to a left, we walk up there, and this wall on the left is the boundary of the graveyard. So after you pass the graveyard, you go through a wooden gate and you enter this field and you keep to the right side with a fence to your right and keep going up. So excuse the panting. It's not that well signposted, but there are a few signs there, look. There. Sorry, didn't mean to disturb you. just passing through. And that's the view down the valley to Pontycymer. So at the top of the hill, it gets a bit confusing. Get to a gate, the fence is on your right, and the signs sort of disappear. There's a path that takes you inland, which you don't take. You basically go to the right of that fence there, the barbed wire fence. So you're still looking out over the valley. And the top of the hill and the electrical poles are on your right up there. So that on your right, views over the valley on your left. I think the path here has been made by the cows. So there's the town on the side of the hill, and we'll be walking into the valley up there. So about 50 yards downhill from me is an old stone wall. And above me is the top of the hill. There aren't any way markers at all, but you want to keep around this level of the hillside, because when we do get around, there's a big wall, but there is a gap in it around this level. There is a small culvert here coming off the hillside, and if it is raining heavily, I imagine this would be quite full. Excuse the heavy breathing again. You won't believe you're on the right path, because there isn't really a path around this side. But trust me, if you keep just below the hilltop, there is a gap in the wall. And here it is. Well, before we get to the other side, if you look just below the hilltop, you can see a line roughly there. And that's the path we're going to be taking. And as you can see compared to this side, it is well defined over there. But it doesn't really matter if you go too high or too low, because we're coming to a dead end, the end of this little side valley. And there's a waterfall. It may not be one today, because it is quite dry for a change, but there is a crossing point ahead of us. Like I said, on the other side of the valley, this section around this mountain is far easier to follow. I think in sections of it, this is where the tram road used to run. Not sure, but around here somewhere, on an old map, it had like remnants of tram road. If you are local to Blaengarw, Pontycymer, and know a bit more about the history of the place, add to the comments, share with us exactly, especially the early days before the 1870s. Well, how Welsh is this? Standing on a mountain, looking down with sheep, terraced houses, and a rugby pitch. Well, just look at this weather. I wasn't expecting this when I started. As you can probably see, below me is Blaengarw, and unlike many valleys which have a pass at the top, this is a dead end. The only way out is back down the road towards Bridgend again. So down there was the site of the Garw Colliery, which was the last to close in the Garw Valley in 1985. During the 1970s, the Garw Valley Colliery, which were now linked, employed 1,000 men. And being from Porthcawl by the sea, we had a thing called Miners' Fortnight. All the mines would close for 2 weeks during the summer, and all the valleys would empty and go down to Barry, Porthcawl, or some other seaside town for 2 weeks. It was packed. So we're heading down the hillside to another small waterfall to follow the road back to Blaengarw and Parc Calon Lan. It was 7 degrees in Porthcawl when I left this morning, and up here it's still frozen. So at the end of the valley now, we'll make our way down to this little pool and waterfall. So we walk around this small pool, over the footbridge and down the road to Blaengarw and Parc Calon Lan. Well, what have we got down here? They're not sheep. What are you? Llamas? Alpacas? I don't know my South American animals. Anyway, They're not native to South Wales. As we walk back down the valley into Blaengarw, we come into a small terrace street called David Street, and we cross the road to Gwendolyn Street, and that's where the car's parked in Parc Calon Lan, which is accessed via Gwendolyn Street. So I'm back in Parc Calon Lan after part 2 of my Garw Valley Walk, and the weather was much better than part 1. Look at it. Sun's out, not too cold, perfect for walking. You can either do part 1 and part 2 separately, or do them all together to form one big circular walk, Blaengarw, Pontycymer, around the hillsides. And that total walk, which is in the map, that's 5 miles, 8 kilometres. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, what I call underrated area, well, underrated, overlooked, I would say, more than underrated, overlooked area of South Wales. It's only about 7 miles from the M4. Definitely worth a trip. So until next time, that's a bye. And remember, keep walking.